and there are 12 of them, were constantly reminding the people that justice was essential. In our first reading this morning, here, number 582, we have the first prophet who lived about 800 years before Jesus. His name was Amos. He was a farmer, and he was called to leave his farm and to go into the city and to preach against those who were exploiting the poor. His time wasn't very much different from our time. You had the growing disparity of the people who worked very hard, and yet their incomes were dwindling in comparison to those who owned the resources. The people they worked for were large farmers, and they would not give the people a fair wage. They squeezed them. Then when the workers on the farms had to go and buy food or necessities, the owners of the stores fixed the scales so that they got less than what they thought they were getting. The owners of these large farms would dilute the wheat, and they'd put weeds in it, and they'd sell that to the poor. The religious leadership at that time, those who were doing the rituals, the sacrifices of the animals, were very associated with the landowners, and they wouldn't question anything. Their mouths were closed, because in their minds, as long as they did the ritual, God was pleased. And so this poor farmer, uneducated, felt called by God to go out and start preaching in the middle of the city, saying, God does not want your rituals. You are hypocrites going to the altars and offering your offerings when you are doing this to your people. This was one of the most famous passages that Martin Luther King used throughout the Civil Rights Movement. So given that background and its relevance today for us and our society, with the 1% versus the 99%, let us read this as if it was written today for us. This is number 582, the prophet Amos, chapter 5, divine justice. I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies.
Even though you offer me your burnt offerings, I will not accept them.
And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals, I will not look upon them.
Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps.
But let justice roll down like waters,
and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream.
Martin Luther King Jr. not only preached from this text time and again, but he saw that justice in his time and ours wasn't just a local issue of people living in local towns trying to treat each other justly. He saw justice as essential as a global phenomenon, because he saw the image of God in every single human being, no matter who they were, and he was aware that if justice was being denied in one place, it affected everyone in the world. And so he wrote this network of mutuality as part of his preaching, number 584. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny.
Injustice anywhere is justice everywhere.
There are some things in our social system to which all of us ought to be maladjusted.
Hatred and bitterness can never cure the disease of fear. Only love can do that.
We must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation.
The foundation of such a method is love.
Before it is too late, we must narrow the gaping chasm between our proclamations of peace and our lowly deeds which precipitate and perpetuate war.
One day we must come to see that peace is not merely a distant goal that we seek, but a means by which we arrive at that goal.
We must pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means.
We shall hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope.
In light of this call for justice and to seek justice in a peaceful way, let us sing together number 170, We Are a Gentle but Angry People.
are singing, singing for our lives. We are gentle, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives.
The prophet Isaiah, who lived in the southern part of Israel, Amos was in the north, spoke truth to power right in the temple, where the largest sacrifices of the Jewish people were conducted on a regular basis, with smoke going up to the sky, animals and grain being brought into the temple. And the priests taught the people in Jerusalem, as long as you keep bringing us the offerings and we keep offering them to God, everything is going to be fine. And yet in Jerusalem, the same thing was happening as was happening in the north where Amos lived. There was injustice to the poor. And so Isaiah, one of the greatest prophets, spoke these words to loose the fetters of injustice. And he speaks for God. Is this not the fast that I choose?
To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke.
Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see them naked to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin?
Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly.
If you remove the yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted,
You shall be like a watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail.
quite strong words. As Madonna indicated, you have been studying in the past the wonderful book by Karen Armstrong, 12 Steps Towards a Compassionate Life. And that's a very helpful book to help us with our personal problems. No matter who we are, we face personal difficulties, challenges, sadness, disappointment. And that book helps us to forgive ourselves, to see ourselves as lovable people, and then to reach out and share the pain of others. And that book is most helpful, and it draws upon some of the deepest teachings of all spiritual traditions. If charity begins at home, so does compassion and love. When I was in the seminary many years ago at Union Theological Seminary, one of the lecturers was a grandson of Franklin Roosevelt, Curtis Roosevelt. And he came in, he worked at the United Nations at that time, this was 1971. He came into the class at Union Seminary in New York, and he said, you future pastors, you're going to be concerned about justice, and you should be concerned about justice. But the congregation sitting in front of you on a Sunday morning are bringing incredible pain. And unless you can deal with that personal pain, you will never open them up to understand the pain of others. And so that's the power of Karen Armstrong's book. The people come to a worship service with much baggage, and they need help for the coming week. The problem is that often the worship service and our religious leaders today stop at that point. And they don't take it the next step after they have made available the scriptural traditions for our personal lives. And yet, that's only half the biblical story. It's only half the story of all religion. The personal must somehow be linked to something larger, because we are all social beings, we are all part of a community, we are all sharing in the Spirit. And that's why in the prophets, which are a major part of the Bible, are so important. And we've heard two of them this morning. That you cannot close your eyes to something beyond your own home if there is pain and suffering going on that are caused by structural issues. Compassion can help deal with personal problems and can motivate us to be charitable, to give charity to others. But it deals with the symptoms of pain, not the underlying causes. Those are caused frequently by larger structural issues. And as both Amos and Isaiah were talking about the larger structural issues, were that the people with power, both economic power and religious power in their times, were manipulating the institutions in order to squeeze the life out of the people. Greed was rampant both in the economy of Israel as well as in the religion. And so we have to go beyond that, and we have to not neglect what these prophets are saying. Jesus himself is really rooted deeply in the prophets. That's the most accurate description of Jesus you can give biblically. He is a prophet like Amos and like Isaiah. That's why he got into trouble. He didn't speak much about heaven. He didn't speak much about faith. He spoke an awful lot about social behavior. If you read the parables of Jesus carefully, he's far more concerned with greed than he is with sexual misdemeanors. It's very clear. And so many of his great parables, the rich man living in sumptuousness and the poor man living outside his gate. The good Samaritan who comes around the bend in the road, he's a foreigner, he's an enemy of the Jews. He stops. Two people before him, a priest and a deacon, didn't stop. Jesus is really hitting the establishment very, very hard, just like Amos and Isaiah did. And frequently that is forgotten or neglected or smoothed over in sermons. We have domesticated Jesus to fit our personal emotional needs. Jesus is a tough character. Now you say, well, what do you do about this? We live in a very complex world. We do. But that doesn't remove us from responsibility. You know, 100 to 150 years ago, if there was a terrible tragedy in the world, we didn't hear about it here for months or sometimes weeks. Now, if something happens, we hear it within an hour. That young girl that was shot in the head in Pakistan, simply because she wanted education for women, we heard it immediately. We know immediately because of technology what's going on in other parts of the world. We have no excuse for not knowing. Not only do we have television, but we have iPads, we have internet, we have Facebook. Information is there. And when people say, well, I didn't know, that is no longer an excuse. Perhaps in biblical times, some people really didn't know how bad it was in other parts of the country. We cannot use that excuse today. People complain about technology being impersonal. I believe technology can make it very personal. Very personal. Let me give you some examples. We are a nation that uses tariffs to protect ourselves and to protect industries and jobs. Now, on the one hand, that can be very helpful because we want to protect American jobs. But sometimes it goes too far. And we protect industries like the sugar industry. We give subsidies to the tobacco industry to this day, which is killing people. George McGovern, God bless him, supported Food for Peace. We're very generous in giving food to other countries. And now we give it not just as a handout, we give it as a payment for work. That was one of his ideas. But we have a problem with farm subsidies, and perhaps this is not very popular in the Midwest to say this, but the farm subsidies, especially to large farmers, are in the billions of dollars. And the purpose of that is so that we can support our farmers, that we can have food here, that if there's ever a world crisis, we have our farmers. That's good. But the downside of that we don't think about is that developing countries that produce food and want to export it, they don't have much manufacturing, so often the only thing they can produce is coffee or sugar or tea or bananas or wheat. They can't sell it on the world market because our goods, farm goods on the world market are kept very low because of the subsidies to our farmers. And that makes it very hard for a poor country to develop. Somewhere there has to be a meeting here of protecting our farmers, but also making it easier for farmers in other countries. And we don't think about that, nor do we ever hear a sermon on it. But that's an issue of justice. Our corporations, which go abroad and make tremendous amount of money, and sometimes close their industries or shops here because of high wages, or what they consider high wages, they go abroad and they can make incredible profits because the labor costs are low. But you know what the average hourly wage throughout the developing world is? 30 cents an hour. 30 cents an hour. Now, granted, the lifestyle and the cost of living is much lower in these countries, but 30 cents an hour does not give a family enough to live on. Why are we not challenging our corporations? If we have put restrictions on corporations at home in terms of labor laws, safety laws, health laws, minimum wage, why do we never ask a question about what they do abroad, especially when we're investing in them? We have stocks in these companies. You see, this is a structural issue. It seems invisible, but it's there. And if Amos and Isaiah and Jesus were here today, they'd be talking about this stuff. There's a book that came out last year called The Tropic of Chaos by journalist Michael Parenti, P-A-R-E-N-T-I. I encourage all of you to take a look at it. He's a journalist who's traveled the world. And what he has done in the last 7 or 8 years is travel the equator. And he's gone around Latin America, Africa, Asia, around the equator. And what's happening around the equator is because of the environmental degradation that's going on, all of the pollutants that we're putting in the air, Europe's putting in the air, now Brazil, now China, now India. What's happening around the equator, the part that's closest to the sun, is you have tremendous drought. We had terrible drought here last summer. They've had drought for 20, 30 years in some of these countries. And what's happening is desperation is emerging. People are angry. The international arms market, part of it coming from our country, is selling weapons to these people, and they are fighting among themselves for water. The wars for the rest of the 21st century, many of them are going to be fought over water. Water is becoming extremely scarce in many parts of the world, and people can't survive without it. Al-Qaeda now is recruiting in some of the most remote villages of countries like Mali in Africa because people are desperate. In the Horn of Africa, they haven't had rain in 60 years. Al-Qaeda is picking those people off and saying, the people who are causing this are the rich people in Europe and the United States. Join us. We are shooting ourselves in the foot by selling weapons to people who hate us because we are part, not the only one, but we are part of a problem that we're not thinking about. These are structural issues. These are issues that we need to think about. Now, as an educator, I've been teaching at Ripon College for 25 years. I talk about this in my classes. I do courses on ethics and international affairs. My training is in political science as well as religion. But it isn't enough, I think, just to read about this and to use an iPad to see pictures. Somehow we're animals, rational animals that learn by experience. So what we've been doing at Ripon, since I've worked in Latin America and I'm fluent, I've been taking students during winter break to Panama. There's a Catholic priest in Panama who grew up on a farm outside of Ripon. He was one of 14 children, Wally Casabuski. He's a Franciscan. And he's been in Panama 25 years. And what he's been doing is the structural stuff like Madonna was describing in the Heifer Project. What he does is he builds water systems for the people. Because when you dig well in Panama, you get brackish water. Because Panama once was under the ocean. So all of the soil is salty. You can't dig a well. The only way you can get water is in the mountains. And it rains for 5 to 6 months. But all that water runs off unless you can build dams in the mountain for reservoirs and then pipe it down to the villages. So for 25 years, he's been working on creating water systems, reservoirs in the mountains, and then PCV pipes buried in this, underneath the earth. And he has now brought water to several thousand people. And the students that I bring to Panama in January, we're going to bring, last year we brought 6, this year we're bringing 10, and we get about 30 or 40 residents of Ripon and Berlin, Fond du Lac that go with us. Carpenters, electricians, plumbers, and we as the students and myself work as apprentices. And we go up in the mountain and the craftsmen tell us what needs to be done. And they've got heavy equipment. He has trained Panamanian men and women to use that equipment. So he's structurally not only changing the environment, but he's training people that can take over to maintain that system when he's long gone. That's justice, that's not charity. Let me read you some of the reflections of the students who went last year, and how they came to understand justice as a structural issue, not just as giving handouts to poor people. and the change of thinking that caused them to think about, these are 21, 22-year-old people, about their future. This is one young woman. While in Panama, I began to think about my future. Since I can remember, I have wanted to be a doctor, specifically something in pediatrics. I have recently given thought to Doctors Beyond Borders. That's that famous non-governmental organization headquartered in Paris. These are doctors all over the world now. They go into very troublesome situations and give free health care. Doctors Without Borders. Médecins Sans Frontières, they call it in France. She's now thinking about that organization. Because the feeling of helping those less fortunate than you is unbelievable. Seeing the difference you are making in their lives, how thankful they are that you are there, and the gratification that you get for yourself is breathtaking. Now here's the structural thinking beginning to develop in this young woman. Even though I knew there was poverty in the world, experiencing it in the way we did in Panama allowed me to understand more. I saw that even though the country was developing, there were parts that were left behind, almost forgotten. With tall skyscrapers in Panama City to huts and dirt floors in Tortí, that's the little village in the jungle where the priest works, I was overwhelmed with a feeling of sadness and anger that there could be such a wide range of living conditions. I have started to give thought to Doctors Beyond Borders as my future career. I would like to begin to build new clinics for underprivileged communities and show them the care they can give the community with the resources they have. Now that's a young woman who's thinking about a future of service, but thinking strategically. She's not just going to make a contribution money. She is going to want to work for an organization that actually builds health clinics. Here's a young man who graduated in May, and he is now working for a water resource agency out in New Mexico. And these are his reflections last January. The last day at the dam site, I was put in charge of shoveling sand into the cement makers. Probably one of the most physically demanding jobs that was done at the dam site. Yeah, it was. I remember the feeling of complete peace and a feeling of complete satisfaction that I have never experienced before. Between reconnecting with nature and being surrounded by a group of people doing something for people they were likely never to meet, while not expecting anything in return, was a very humbling experience. The entire trip put into perspective the amount of good that can be done by a few organized, motivated people. Think of what Madonna was talking about the Sisters of St. Agnes. A few organized, committed people. I pictured poverty as more of a money issue than a resource issue. After my trip to Panama, I understand that simply sending food and water isn't enough to solve the problem. That's charity. Although many of the people in Panama have enough money to buy the supplies they need to live healthy lives, there is nowhere to purchase them. So instead, they are stuck paying money for substandard drinking water. Before the dams were built, people would have to drink out of muddy streams. Or they'd have to buy water off trucks coming to the village. Stagnant water, water filled with amoebas. That's how they lived. With the work of Father Wally on the dam, we will be able to use, the people will be able to use their money to buy clean drinking water. They will pay for the water system that's being built. They all have meters in their houses. And each month they have to pay their water bill. And that helps maintain the system. So it's training not in socialism or communism, but good petty capitalism. And they're going to pay for the system. And the workers he's trained earn their keep by working for the system. Father Wally is taking charge of many contracts given to him by the government, such as building roads and bridges, which will provide even more jobs to the locals who need the money. In Panama, business is corrupt, as it is in many developing countries. So the Panamanian government sees this Catholic priest who has the technical ability, and they trust him, and they give him the contracts, and his use of the money is always sufficient. So he builds roads, he builds schools for them, he builds clinics, because he's an honest man, and he has workers that he's trained who are honest. So this young man from Ripon is really coming to see that there are ways you can make a difference if you go at it the right way and if you associate with the right people. And he said, I now am interested in the future in the Peace Corps. He did apply to the Peace Corps, and I wrote a letter for him when he came home. And he's on a waiting list. So this year he's working on a water system out in New Mexico. Another young woman who is a junior now, this was her first time she ever was on an airplane. I went to Panama last January. She says, I learned so much about myself on this trip. I realized I can handle a lot more than I thought I ever could. I can handle spiders, snakes, bumpy rides, large rocks, dust in the eyes. I can handle cold showers. We have no warm water down there. And I can live without TV or internet. No glamour. No cell phone. I realize I can do this, and because I can, I should. I've begun seriously to consider the Peace Corps after graduating because I know I can handle it. God has given me the strength and ability to help people, and I believe it is my responsibility to do so. I now know I'm going back to Panama next year. She's on the trip, signed up for this coming January. Hopefully for many years to come. The experience changed my life, and I had the time of my life. I started looking into the Peace Corps, and I think it's something I should do. I've also regained a deeper connection with my faith. And I hope to get more involved in my church community when I go back home. And here's a young woman who was amazed at the age of the people who went. The oldest person on our trip was 78. The youngest was 18. This young woman who was 18 said, I decided that when I was older, like these other people here, I wanted to be like them. And I thought about it. And every year when I'm older, instead of going on vacation, I would like to go and do a service trip in a foreign country. You're never too old to do works of justice. Now that's an example of when you can think of a way to introduce people experientially to something. Then they begin to catch it. Now, what I would like you to think about, you probably know this already, is that your Unitarian Universalist Service Committee is a very fine organization that does international work. And if you haven't done it, I would urge you to go on www.uusc.org. When I was teaching years ago on the East Coast at MIT, I taught political science before I came to Ripon. I was on the board of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. Their headquarters are in Boston. And I was on the board for a year, and I was absolutely astounded at the kind of projects that UUSC takes on, not only domestically but internationally. And right now, they have on their website a description of their projects. They have a human rights in humanitarian crises situation where they go into countries and work at the grassroots after hurricanes and earthquakes. And they don't just give food and medicine, they help organize people so that the organization then can continue after they're gone. They strengthen women's and girls' ability to protect themselves from violence in wars and crises. They also work with youth groups in the Middle East. Works on civil liberties in Middle Eastern countries, as well as in Tunisia and Egypt. That's dangerous stuff. But they're in there working with young people to help them know their rights and help them organize. I can't help but think if some of that may have led to the Arab Spring, where these young people really began to stand up and ask for democracy. On economic justice, the UUSC is working to raise the minimum wage in this country. They're also trying to promote fairer trade and a set of principles and practices that equally distributes wealth and provides producers and farmers with a living wage, connecting with farmers in developing countries and then selling their goods here. You've seen fair trade coffee in the stores. It's a few pennies more, but that coffee has been produced under safe conditions where the laborers are getting a fair wage. So there are things that UUSC are doing for justice. They're involved in international water projects, both in many developing countries, helping people farm the soil so that it doesn't get depleted, and to use soil-friendly methods of cultivating the soil and so on. So there's a lot here. So even though the problems are big, A, there are ways of finding out about it, and B, there are ways to get involved. And I'm sure your community can do more with UUSC in terms of supporting projects, or maybe even volunteering to go on some of these projects that they support. So there is no excuse for not being concerned about justice. And in fact, I often think that if there is a final judgment, and I believe there is, I think we're going to get asked questions about if we're the richest, most powerful nation in the world, and we are a citizen of this nation, what did we do? What did we do about the world when we had the information and the ability to make a difference? That's going to be a very disturbing question. I don't think we're going to get asked questions, how often did you go to church? Did you say prayers? We are nice to people. I think there are bigger issues when you read what Jesus and the prophets are talking about. And so just for our own eternal salvation, justice, that's not the best motive, but it's something to consider. Anyway, let me leave you with something to think about. How do you build a just society? One of the things we do at Ripon is we compare to world religions, and the students get very interested in Eastern religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism. And Confucius was a very practical man. He was an educator. And his vision of a just society was this: 3 circles. This was the home, where respect and concern for others is learned through discipline. Then you have the school. The child leaves home, goes out to the school, and if the child has learned respect, it carries into the school, and the teachers have a peaceful classroom. His thinking was then, if you have trained children at home, and then they have developed relationships at schools with people outside the home to treat them well, to show them respect, then his 3rd circle was government, that people would then go out and work in government and be honest officials. And the Confucian method of education was used in China for right after about 200 BC up to about 1901. Every public official in China learned Confucian ethics of respect. Now, our society is not structured that way. Our founding fathers were afraid of this. They said this can become smothering of this. So our society looks like this. We have another circle. We have the home down here. Then we have the school. Yes, this is the first place people go. But then we have something called out here civil society. Civil society is all those private organizations that exist and flourish in order to keep the government from becoming repressive. And that was the whole insight of checks and balances and of our system. And the capitalist system, the free market, free enterprise, is supposed to promote freedom, development, to keep the government from making all the decisions. Socialism, communism, bad. We have a free market system. We also have in civil society political parties. We have voluntary organizations. We have interest groups. We have churches. So there's a whole group out here that flourish, that we can participate in, develop ourselves, and keep the government limited. Now, there's a problem. It hadn't been foreseen by the founding fathers. What's happened out here is that money has taken over. That one of the sectors, business, through the use of money has set up PACs, interest groups, and it's no longer now government being a problem, it's this controlling government through interest groups, through electing officials. We have reversed the process. This was set up by our founding fathers to prevent that from getting bad. What's happened is sectors of this have taken over that. You have to have millions to run for office, and then you're beholden to those groups. And then those groups have made alliances with political parties, with interest groups, with PACs. You still have your voluntary organizations, and you've got your religious organizations. But they're very small. Mm-hmm. And your religious organizations are unwilling to challenge them. I had a student last summer at Ripon College, and this will be my last story. A young woman who had taken my religion and politics course last spring, and she got very interested in this issue of social justice and about how in the past churches, civil rights movement, peace movement spoke about social justice. And she was concerned she wasn't hearing. She's a practicing Christian, Methodist. Why aren't we hearing that today? So she interviewed last summer all 12 pastors in Ripon. Every one, including the Unitarian president. And she worked out a questionnaire about what they preach about. Do they ever preach about social justice? And what issues? Except for the Unitarian president. Every one of the others said, that is partisan politics. I can't preach about that because that's politics. Now, justice is politics because politics is a discussion on the use of power and the distribution of resources. So it's political. But it's political with a small p. Political with a big P is Republican, Democratic, Green Party, whatever. Those are partisan groups. They're fine, but they have a particular partisan view, whereas social justice is universal, and social justice requires looking at all the institutions and what they need. The pastors said explicitly they would not touch that because these issues of the economy or the environment or foreign policy or poverty, these are political issues and we don't talk about that in church.
What do they talk about?
So what do they talk about? Well, she gave them a list, and she listed about 12 things. You want to guess what was on number 1?
Sin.
Well, yeah, sin. But which public policies do you think? They do talk about some public policies.
Abortion.
Abortion. What's number 2?
Gay marriage.
Homosexuality. Bingo.
But those aren't political.
They are. They are. So all the other things that she had down on there, the environment, the poor, they did say that they're concerned about the poor, so they have feeding programs, they have charity programs. There's a thrift store in Ripon run by one of the churches. Now that's fine, but it's not justice. And I was really stunned because I didn't think it was that bad. But it is bad. I mean, we do not have the Martin Luther King Jr.'s or the Bill Coffins around anymore. They get picked off. They get picked off in the seminary. What the sisters are experiencing, the Vatican, I'm a Roman Catholic, I was a priest for 9 years. I know how it works. People get afraid. And either the higher-ups try to muzzle them, or the congregations fire them. They don't want to hear this stuff. You've got to be pretty courageous to give a sermon on one of these issues. And the thing is, you don't have to be a Republican or a Democrat when you talk about water systems, you talk about income inequality, you talk about unfair tax systems, or some of the things of our trade policy or what corporations do abroad. That's not Democrat or Republican, that's American issues. So I don't want to leave you depressed. That isn't fair. Because you do have little islands of hope in here. You do have your Unitarian Service Committee. You have a lot of religious NGOs that are much more liberal than the pastors who are sending them money, like Catholic Relief Services, Church World Services. These are idealistic young men and women who don't want to go into business or politics, and so they go into these organizations and they make a difference abroad. They make a difference. I did a book on non-governmental organizations about 15 years ago, and I went around Latin America, and in Colombia especially, and I saw tremendous little projects that these NGOs were sponsoring. They are out there. You have advocacy groups here that are trying to speak the truth to politics. But we do need more courageous religious leaders because the moral leaders in this country do make a difference. 40% of Americans go to a house of worship on a weekend. And the churches have the potential, synagogues, mosques, to be educators. So encourage, when you meet a pastor who is doing this, encourage that pastor. And then find groups that you can support who are trying to question this and offset this. But it's difficult. But there are ways to do it, just like those young people at Ripon College who went to Panama. That was a small project, but it opened their eyes. There are many of these projects. So don't lose hope. You have to find the projects, find who's doing it, and then support them. So, not too far, but if you want to give any feedback or...
We had planned and hoped that there would be time for the talk back, but given the time on the clock, we'll just invite you to continue conversation during our coffee hour. And before we sing our closing hymn, I would invite you to support the work and presence of Open Circle in our community and in the larger world with your gifts, so that we can continue to be a transforming presence in our community.
please.